In this section, we're going to look at building forms in Angular. So by the end of this section, you'll be able to implement forms with different kinds of input fields, such as text boxes, checkboxes, radio buttons, and drop-down lists. You'll be able to display validation errors next to input fields and disable the submit button if the form is not in a valid state. So now let's get started. All right, we're going to start this section by creating a simple Bootstrap form. And then we're going to bring that to life and add some validation to it using Angular. So here, let's open up the terminal and generate a new component. So ng-gc, let's call this contact-form. Okay, now let's go to contact.html, delete all the markup here. We want to add a form. We don't need this action attribute. Inside this form, we need two input fields. One is the first name and the other is comment. So once again, I'm going to use Zen coding to quickly generate markup. So first we need a label. Next to this, we want an input. I want the type of this input to be text. So note that you can use square brackets to put any attributes here. Now this input field should have a class called form-control. And this is one of the classes defined in Bootstrap that gives our input field a nice modern look and feel. So tab, this is our markup. Let's break it up. So with this input field, we can set an ID here. Let's call this first name. And note that I'm using camel notation. So the first letter of the first word is lowercase and the first letter of every word after is uppercase. Now, if we use this ID here as the value for the for attribute of the label, this improves the accessibility of our form. So when the user clicks on this label, this input field here will automatically get focus. Okay. Now, finally, we need to wrap these two elements inside a div with the class form-group. This is one of the requirements by Bootstrap. So we want a div with the class form-group. Now let's move this stuff here. Okay. Now this time I'm going to generate all this markup in one go. So we want to start with a div with the class form-group. Now inside this div, we want a label, and this label should have an attribute called for set to, let's say, comment. Now next to this label, we want an input with an ID attribute set to comment. Actually, let's change this to a text area so we can have multiple lines. Now this text area should also have a class called form-control. Tab. Okay, here's our markup. Here's our div. We have a label inside that. And next to that, we have a text area. We don't need this name attribute, so let's delete this. And here's the closing div element. Now finally, we need a button. This button should have two classes. One is btn and the other is btn-primary. And let's call this submit. Now one more thing is that each of these label elements need a value. So the first one should be first name and the second should be comment. Okay. Now finally, let's use this form on our homepage. First, let's go to contact.ts. I want to change the selector here. We don't really need this app-prefix. It's extra noise. Add it only if it's clashing with another component defined somewhere else, something that you're importing from a third-party library. So finally, let's go to app.html, delete all the markup here, and add our contact-form element. Now let's preview this. So back in the browser, this is our contact form. So first name, comment, and our submit button. So we have built this simple form. Now we want to add validation to it. In Angular, we have a class called form-control. For each input field in our form, we need to create an instance of the control class. And with this control class, we can check the current value stored in an input field. We can see if the input field has been touched or untouched. We can see if it's dirty, which means its value is changed, or pristine, which means its value is not changed, whether it's valid or not, and if it's not, what are the validation errors. So for each input field in the form, we need a control object. Now, similar to the control class, we have another class called form group, which represents a group of controls in a form. Each form is essentially a control group because it contains at least one control. But in a complex application, you might have a form with multiple control groups. For example, you might have a control group for the shipping address and another for the billing address. Now, interestingly, all the properties of the control class that you saw earlier are also available in the form group class as well. So we can ask a form group if it's valid or not. And that returns true if all the controls in that group are valid. Similarly, we can get all the validation errors in that group. So accessing these properties of a form group is easier than iterating over all the controls in that group and checking their status. So to add validation to a form, we need to create a form group object for the form and a form control object for each input field in the form. This way, we can keep track of the state of each input field and the entire form as a whole. Now, there are two ways to create these control objects. One way is by applying some directives in our template, and Angular will create these control objects for us implicitly under the hood. We call forms that are built this way template-driven forms. So we build them using their template. Another approach involves explicitly creating these control objects. So in our components, we should write code to create new instances of the control group and control objects. We call forms that are built this way as reactive forms. Previously, they used to be called model-driven forms. Now they are called reactive forms. Now you might ask, what is the difference? What is the difference between template-driven forms and reactive forms? The difference is that when we create these control objects explicitly, we have more control over their validation logic. So if you want to build a complex form with complex validation, you need to use reactive forms. You need to create these control objects explicitly. And also, another benefit of this approach is that you can unit test the validation logic of your form. Otherwise, if you want to build a simple form with some basic validation, like making some fields required or within a given range, then you can use template-driven forms. So template-driven forms are easier to create. We write less code, but we have also less control over the validation of our form. Now, in this section, we're going to look at template-driven forms, and we'll leave reactive forms to the next section. So we have built this basic Bootstrap form. Now we want to add validation to this using template-driven approach. So as I explained in the last lecture, with template-driven approach, we apply a directive to our input field, and Angular will create a control object and associated with that input field under the hood. Now guess what? You already know this directive. That is ng model. So here on this first name input field, I'm going to apply the ng model directive. We used this before with the two-way binding syntax or banana in a box. Remember that? So we used it like this. Here's a box, here's a banana, and we used ng model like this and bound this to a property or a field in our component, like first name. Now here we don't need two-way binding yet. Perhaps we can add this in the future, but all I want to show you is that when you apply the ng model directive on an input field, in its simplest form, without any binding, Angular will create a control object and associate it with this input field under the hood. Now, let's preview this in the browser. So back in Chrome, we get this error. If ng model is used within a form tag, either the name attribute must be set or the form control must be defined as standalone. So basically, the reason we got that error is that we didn't set a name attribute here. This is a requirement because every time we apply this ng model on an input field, and it needs a way to distinguish these control objects. So here we set the name attribute. I'm going to use the same value as the ID. So first name. Save. Now back in the browser, the error is gone. Now I want to show you that control object under the hood. So these two attributes are all you need to set in order to use the template-driven approach. But in this video, I want to show you what is happening under the hood. So I want to handle the change event of this input field. And here we're going to call the log method. Now I need a reference to this ng model directive. I want to pass that reference to the log method so we can log it on the console. For that, we're going to create a template variable. So hashtag, let's call that template variable first name. You could call it anything. And as the value, I'm going to use ng model. So when Angular sees this, it's going to set this template variable to the ng model directive that is applied on this input field. Okay? And then we can pass this variable to our log method. So here's the log method. We pass first name. Now let's go and implement this method. So back in our component, I'm going to delete the stuff that we don't need. Let's just keep it simple. Here's the log method. Let's give it a parameter called x and simply log it on the console. This is just for diagnostics. Now back in the browser, I'm going to type my name here, press tab. Now let's take a look at the console. Okay, here's our ng model. So you can see ng model is an object with these properties. Now look at this property, control. This is the control object that I was telling you about. Now if you click on the value, look, it's an instance of the form control class in Angular. Let's expand this. Here we have a bunch of properties, and many of these properties come in pairs. For example, we have this dirty, which determines if the value of the input field is changed from the moment the form was initialized. In this case, because I typed my name here, dirty is true. Now the opposite property is pristine. Pristine means clean. So dirty should be true and pristine is false. Okay? Now we have another pair, invalid and valid. In this case, because we haven't implemented validation yet, this input field is considered valid. So invalid should be false and valid should be true. Now, if we have any validation errors, they're available here. Currently, errors is null because we don't have any errors. We have another pair, which is touched and untouched. In this case, because I touched the input field, or in other words, I put the focus there and then moved away, touched should be true and untouched should be false. We have another important property, value, which returns the current value in the input field. So what I want you to note here is that we use this form control class to track state changes and the validity of input fields. When we apply the ng model directive along with the name attribute on an input field, Angular automatically creates an instance of the form control class and associates it with this input field. Now to finish up this lecture, I'm going to apply ng model on our text area as well and set the name attribute to comment. In the next lecture, we're going to add some validation here. All right, now let's make this first name field required. So in HTML5, we can use this required attribute on an input field, and Angular uses this to apply this kind of validation on this input field. So just next to this input field, I want to add a div. This is where we'll display the validation error. So first name is required. Now to make this pretty, we can apply two Bootstrap classes. One is alert and the other is alert-danger, which puts this in a red box. Now we don't want to display this at all times. We want to display this only if the input field is not valid. So we use the ngIf directive that you have seen before. Now how do we know if the field is valid or not? Well, back here in the console, you saw this ng model directive, right? And we looked at this control property. This control has a property called valid. From here, we can tell if an input field is valid or not. But there is a simpler way. So let's collapse this property. If you look at the properties of this ng model directive, we have all those properties you saw earlier as part of this class as well. So here we have valid, which is a computed property. So when we use this property, internally, the ng model directive delegates to the underlying form control object. So here, as the value of the ngIf directive, we can reference our directive. So earlier we created this template variable first name. We can type first name dot valid. Now we apply the not operator here. So we'll render this div only if the first name is not valid. Let's test the result. So back in the browser. Okay, you can see the error is initially displayed here, which is a little bit too confronting for the user because they haven't done anything wrong yet. So I will show you how to fix this problem in a second. Let's type something here. Look, as soon as I type one character, the error is gone. And when I delete this, the error is back. So the validation is working. Now let me show you how to show this error only if the user puts focus in this input field and moves away without entering a value. So back here, I'm going to change this condition. I'm going to add first name dot touched and first name not valid. With this, I'm telling Angular to render this div if this input field has been touched, which means it received focus, but the user left this input field without entering a valid value. So let's try it again, back in the browser. So look, initially the error is not here. Now I'll put the focus. If I press tab, I get this error. So this is how we add the validation errors. Next to each input field, we add a div with the validation error and render it only if that input field has been touched and is not valid. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you different kinds of validation errors. So in the last lecture, you saw the required validation error. In Angular, we have a few built-in validators that are based on HTML5 validation attributes. So let's say we want to set a minimum length for our first name. We can set that here. It has to be minimum 3 characters. We can also set a maximum length. Let's say 10 characters. Now finally, we can also apply a pattern. Now in case of a first name, it doesn't quite make sense, but if you have something that you want to apply regular expression validation on, you can use this pattern attribute. So I'm going to set this to banana, and this means only the word banana is a valid value in this input field. Now, when you have multiple validation attributes, you cannot show them all with one div, like here. We want specific validation errors, okay? So we want to make a small change here. First, I'm going to remove this validation error here. Now, inside this div, we want to have a separate div for each validation error. So, div first name is required. Now, we want to render this only if we have the required validation error. So here, as the value for the ngIf directive, we type first name. Remember here we have a property called errors. Now from here, we can check to see if we have this error required. So in this errors object, we have one or more key value pairs, and the keys are the validation errors. I'm going to show you the content of this errors object in a second. Now let's add the second div. So another div, first name should be minimum 3 characters. Okay. Now once again, we want to render this only if first name dot errors dot min length is true. Now I'm going to duplicate this, and for the last one, I'm going to use pattern. So first name doesn't match the pattern. Okay. Now let's inspect this in the browser. So initially no error. I put the focus here, move away. We get this error message. First name is required. I type only 1 character. Now look, we have 2 errors. First name should be minimum 3 characters. And the second error is about a regular expression. So if I type 2 more characters, the first error is gone, but the value we have here doesn't match the pattern. So let me change this to banana, and all the errors are gone. So this is how we add multiple validation constraints on an input field. We simply use these standard HTML5 attributes, required, min length, max length, and pattern. And for each error, we'll have a separate div. Now, finally, before we finish this lecture, let me show you the content of this errors object. So once again here, I'm going to type 1, 2. Now let's open up the console. So here's our ng model. we have this errors object. Look, we have two key value pairs. Keys are min length and pattern. Look at the values. So this object has two properties: actual length, which is 2, and the required length, which is 3. We can take advantage of these properties and render a dynamic message to the user. So here for the min length validation error, instead of hard coding this value 3 here, we can render it dynamically, because tomorrow we may decide to change the value of the min length attribute. We don't want to change this in two places, okay? So here we add interpolation and render first name dot errors dot min length dot. Now the property we want to add here is required length. So dot required length. Let's test this. So back here, I type only 2 characters, tab, and first name should be minimum 3 characters, which is rendered dynamically. Back to our form, I want to type an invalid value here. Now, as a best practice, we should highlight the invalid input fields. This improves the usability of our form. So how do we apply a red border to this input field? Well, let's inspect this. All right, here's our input field. Now, there are so many attributes here. Don't worry about them. Just look at this part, class. So we have the form-control class that we applied in our template, but we also have 3 more classes that are added by Angular dynamically. One is ng-invalid, the other is ng-dirty, and ng-touched. We can use these classes to apply styles to invalid input fields. So let's go to styles.css. Here I'm going to add a new rule. So if you have an element with the class form-control, which should be applied on all input fields, and also on the same element we have ng-touched as well as ng-invalid. I want to make the border of that element 2 pixel solid red. Let's try it. Back in the browser. So I put the focus here and tab, and here we have a red border. As you build forms with Angular, you will notice that your templates get more complex. Now in this video, I have increased the font size, and for that reason, you don't see all the markup here. So we have to scroll to the right. However, on your screen, chances are you have everything in one view. But what I want to point out here is that as a best practice, your code should be formatted in such a way that another developer does not have to scroll to the right and to the left to see what's happening. So let me show you a cleaner way to write this template. We can break up these lines and list one attribute on each line. For example, consider this input field. We can add all these attributes like this, one on each line. And note that I'm listing all the validation attributes first, so another person, another developer reading this code, they know immediately what are the validation constraints of this input field. After these, I add ng-model, and immediately follow that, I add the name attribute, as well as first name set to ng-model. Now, we don't really need this event binding here. This is purely for this demo. And finally, we add ID, type, and class. Now, similarly, we can format our validation errors like this. So we have the parent div. I add all the classes here, and then ng-if. So here you can easily see this ng-if without having to scroll to the left and right. Now for each validation error, we can break it up like this. So I put the error on the next line, and this is much easier to the eyes, like this. So this is the end result, which is way cleaner than what we had before. So you have learned that when we apply the ng-model directive on an input field, Angular creates a form control object under the hood and associates that with this input field. You also learned that we have another class in Angular called form group. So we have form control, which represents one input field, and form group, which represents a group of form controls. Now each form is a form group because it has at least one control. Now on the top, here's the form element. Angular by default applies a directive here that is called ngForm. Let's go to angular.io and look at the documentation of the ngForm directive. So here we type ngForm. You can see it's a directive. Let's have a look. So this directive, just like ngModel, is defined in Angular/forms. Now, if you scroll down, under selectors, look at the selectors. The first selector references any form elements that doesn't have ngNoForm and form group attributes. So you know what these selectors are. When we create components, when we create directives, we set a selector. And when Angular sees an element that matches that selector, it applies that component or directive on that element. So with this first selector here, when Angular finds a form element without these attributes here, it's going to automatically apply the ngForm directive on that element. So here's our form element. We don't have those attributes, which means Angular is going to automatically apply the ngForm directive here. Now we can create a template variable to get a reference to that ngForm directive. So once again, I'm going to declare a template variable. We can call it f as in short for form and set it to ngForm. So previously we used a similar technique. With our input field, we defined this template variable, first name, and set it to ngModel. Now here, instead of ngModel, we set this template variable to ngForm. Okay. Now back in the documentation of ngForm directive, under outputs, you can see this directive has an output property, ngSubmit. And as you remember, we use output properties to raise custom events. So this directive exposes an output property called ngSubmit that we can use in our event binding expressions. So back here, we can use event binding and bind ngSubmit event to a method in our component. Let's call this method submit. Now, as an argument to this method, I want to pass f, which is a reference to our ngForm directive. I want to show you that directive in the console. So let's go to our component and add this method submit that takes f. Now here we simply log it in the console. Now back in the browser, I'm going to type banana here and some comment, submit the form. Now look in the console. So here's our ngForm directive. It's an object with a bunch of familiar properties. So all those paired properties you saw earlier, we have them here as well. We have dirty and pristine, which tells us if the form as a whole is dirty or not. We have errors, which returns all the errors in the form. We have touched and untouched. We have valid and invalid, just like before. Now look at this form property. This form is of type form group. So just like we have form control, which represents one input field, we have form group, which represents a group of input fields. If we expand this form object, again, we see those pair properties. So this is the actual form group object under the hood. And when the ngForm directive is applied to a form element, it basically creates this object and it exposes these pair properties here, which are computed properties, which basically delegate to this underlying form group object. So this means in our submit method, we can access properties like f.valid, f.invalid, f.errors, if we want to do something programmatically. Now back here, we have one more important property called value. Let's look at this. So value is an object with two properties, comment and first name. And you can see the values I put in the form. So those name attributes we assigned to each input field determine the name of the key or the property in this value object. So this value object is a JSON representation of our form. In a real world scenario, in our submit handler here, we can simply get f.value and then we have a JSON object that we can send to an API on the server for persistence. Sometimes when you're working with complex forms, you might have multiple groups in your form. So back in our previous example, look at this value property. I've made a tiny change in our form, and now instead of the first name property, we have contact, which is a complex object. So this contact currently has only one property, which is first name. Potentially here we could have last name, email, whatever. Also, we could have address property, which could be another complex object We could have shipping, billing, you got the point. So how do we represent a structure like this? Well, just like we have the ng model directive, we also have ng model group directive. So back in our template, I'm going to add a div here and apply ng model group directive to it and set the value to contact. Okay, so this represents the sub-property in our value object. Now, here's our first form group that includes our first name field. I'm going to collapse this markup and cut it and move it inside our model group. Okay, save. That's all we have to do. So here's our model group called contact. Inside this group, we have our first name field. And with this change, now our value object is a complex object that is hierarchical. So we have the contact group, and here we have the first name. So in your applications, the API you have on the server may expect a complex nested object structure like this. If that's the case, you use the ng model group directive. Also, similar to the ng model, you can get a reference to this directive using a template variable. So here we can define a template variable called contact and set it to ng model group directive. Now we can reference this contact variable anywhere in this template, and this is useful if you want to validate an entire group as a whole. Let's say you have a group called billing details, and you want to display all the validation errors for the billing details on top of that group. If that's the case, then you would have a div. Here, you would have ngIf, and we can use this template variable contact to see if this entire group is valid or not. And of course, inside this div, we're going to have all the validation errors for that group. Now, if you're confused about all these classes and directives, let me make it super simple for you. In Angular, we have two classes to keep track of the state of input fields and their validity. One is form control, which represents only one input field, and the other is form group, which represents a group of input fields. Now, when we apply the ng model directive on an input field, Angular automatically creates a form control object and associates that with that input field. So this is form control and ng model. Now, form group class is used to represent an entire form and optionally groups within a form. Now, as we explained before, we have a directive called ngForm that is automatically applied to all form elements. So Angular automatically applies the ngForm directive to your forms, and this will internally create a form group object and associate it with your form. And with this form group object, we can track the state changes of the form and its validity. Now, if you have a complex form with multiple subgroups, we can optionally apply the ng model directive on a subgroup. And this directive, similar to the ngForm directive, will also create a form group object for that group. Now, you might be curious, what is the difference between ngForm and ng model group? The difference is that the ngForm directive exposes an output property, which you saw earlier, that is ng submit. And we use this to handle the submit event of forms. ng model group doesn't have that output property because it doesn't make sense to submit a part of a form. So this is all about form control, form group, and the related directives. There is a tiny problem in this form. I can simply click the submit button without providing a valid value for the first name. So ideally, we want to disable this button and enable it only if the form is in a valid state. Let me show you how to do this. It's very easy. So earlier we declared this template variable f and set it to the ngForm directive. Using this directive, we can check the validity of the form as a whole. So right here where we have this button, we can use property binding and bind the disabled property to f.valid. So if f is not valid, or if the form is not valid, we want to disable this button. Let's try it. So back in the browser, look, initially the button is not enabled, right? But if I type a valid value here, which is currently banana based on the regular expression that we defined, Now the button is enabled. All right, so far we have only looked at input fields of type text. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to add a checkbox to this form. So back to our template. Here's the form group for our comment box. Now, right after that, I want to add a checkbox. In order to render a checkbox using Bootstrap, we need a div with the class checkbox. Inside this div, we need a label. And inside this label, we need an input of type checkbox. Tab. Let's break this up. All right, here we don't need the for attribute. And next, in front of this input, we want to add the actual label, like subscribe to mailing list. Now, similar to the other input fields, we need to apply the ng model directive here. And as you know, Angular will create an instance of the form control object for this input field. And we should also set the name attribute is subscribe. Now, let me show you a technique. Right after this div, I'm going to add a paragraph. And here I'm going to use interpolation to render f.value. So this is the JSON object that represents our form, the values entered into the form, okay? Now we have a pipe that is called JSON, and this will format this value object as JSON. Sometimes I use this as a diagnostic tool to see the object I have behind my forms. Let's have a look. So back in the browser, so this is f.value formatted as JSON. You can see we have 3 key value pairs: first name, comment, and is subscribe. Now currently, none of these keys have a value. However, when I click on this subscribe to mailing list, look, the value of this property is true. And if I untick it, now it's false. If I type something in the comment box, look, here we have the value. So adding a checkbox is exactly like adding a text box. We apply the ng model directive along with the name attribute. Now let me show you how to add a drop-down list to this form. So back in our template, just before our JSON object, I'm going to add a div with the class form-group. Inside this div, we want a label. And next to this label, we want a select with the class form-control. Now we can give this select an ID attribute. So ID, we set this to, let's say, contact method. Now we can use the same value as the for attribute of the label. So square brackets, for, we set this to contact method. Now put the cursor at the end and press tab. All right, so here's our markup. We have a div with the class form group. Inside this div, we have a label and a select. Now, just like other input fields, we need to apply the ng model directive on our select. And we should also set the name attribute. So contact method. Now let's set the actual label here. So contact method. And finally, we need to populate this drop-down list. So as you know, in HTML, we have one or more options inside a select element like this. However, in most real-world applications, we don't hard code these options here. Most of the time, we call an API on the server to get, let's say, the list of contact methods. And then we populate this drop-down list dynamically. So let me show you how to do this. We go back to our component. Here, I'm going to define a field called contact methods. So for now, we don't want to worry about getting these objects from the server. Let's imagine somehow we got these objects. Now they are available in our component. So contact methods. I'm going to set this field to an array of objects. Each object should have 2 properties. One is ID and the other is name. So name is what we show to the user and ID is what we send to the server for persistence. Now let me duplicate this. So for the second object, I'm going to use ID2 and name phone. Now back in our template, let's delete these hard-coded options. We want to render these options dynamically. How do we do this? You already know that. We use the ng-for directive. So option, tab, we apply the ng-for directive here. let method of contact methods. And then we use property binding with this value property. So we bind this value property to method.id. And for the label, we use interpolation. So we render method.name. Let's have a look at the result. So back in the browser, okay, this is our contact method dropdown list. You can see email is selected by default, but in our JSON object, contact method does not have a value because this value is only set when we make a selection here. In other words, when I set this to, let's say, phone, now the value of contact method is changed. So in a lot of real-world applications, we don't want a value to be selected here by default. We want to have an empty option and enforce the user to make a selection. So back in our template, I'm going to add another option here, just a blank option with no value. Save, back in the browser. So look, currently, contact method doesn't have a value. And then when I set this to email, okay, now the value is 1. So this is how we work with dropdown lists. Now let's take this to the next level. In most applications, you want to send only this value to the server, like 1. But sometimes you may want to set the value of this contact method property to the actual contact method object. That is the object with two properties, ID and name. Let me show you how to do this. First, let's inspect this dropdown list. So we have this select and a couple of options. Now each option, as you can see here, has a value attribute. This value attribute can only be a string in HTML. So we cannot store an actual contact method object here. To solve this issue, we need to go back to our template. And instead of binding the value property, we need to bind ng value. So ng value is an attribute directive that exposes the ng value property. And we can bind this to a complex object, like the method or contact method object. Now let's look at the result. So back in the browser, note that when I select a contact method here, the value of contact method property is an actual object. Here we have an object with two properties, ID and name. Once again, in most applications, you don't want to do this, but if you really want to set the value of a property to a complex object, you use the ng value property instead of the standard value property. So back in our template, I'm going to change this back to value and bind it to method.id. Now let me show you one last thing. Sometimes you want to allow the user to select multiple options. So here we can apply the multiple attribute. So multiple. Now back in the browser. So this is the interface for a drop-down list that supports multiple selection. I can select email, hold down the shift, select phone, and now look at the value of the contact method property. It's an array of integers, 1 and 2. Now finally, let's see how we can add a group of radio buttons here. So to add a radio button using Bootstrap, we need a markup like this. We start with a div with the class radio. Inside this div, we need a label. And inside this label, we need an input of type radio. Now, radio buttons allow only one selection. So we need to assign these radio buttons to a group. And in that group, we'll have only one selection. So here we need to set another attribute. That is name. That's the name of the group. Let's use our contact method as an example. Contact method. Okay. So tab. All right. So this is the actual markup. We have a div with the class radio. Inside that, we have a label. And inside that, we have an input of type radio. Now we put the actual label here. So back to our example of contact methods, let's add email as a label here and set the value of this input field to 1. Now this is how we hard code a bunch of radio buttons in our form. Sometimes you need to render them dynamically, and I'm going to show you how to do that in just a few seconds. So let's duplicate this radio button like this. For the second one, I'm going to set the label to phone and change the value to 2. Back in the browser. So this is what we get, and we have a single selection in that group. Now, just like other input fields, we need to apply the ngModel directive on each of these radio buttons. So ngModel, and one more time, ngModel. Note that currently our input fields have a name attribute, so we don't have to reset them. Now back in the browser. So our contact method property currently doesn't have a value. But if I select email, now the value of this property is 1. Or if I select phone, it's 2. Perfect. So if you want to hardcode radio buttons, this is how you do it. But what if you want to render them dynamically based on the objects that you retrieve from the server? Well, it's very easy. So let's delete this second radio button. We want to repeat this markup for each contact method. So once again, we apply the ng4 directive here. Let method of contact methods. Now for the value, we're going to use property binding and bind this to method.id. And for the label, we want to use interpolation and render method.name. As simple as that. Back to the browser. Now our contact methods are rendered dynamically. All right, now I want you to use what you have learned in this section and build a form like this. So this form is for a Udemy instructor to create a new course. We have 3 input fields. One is the course name, which is required and should have minimum 3 characters. So let me show you. When I put the focus here and press tab, I get the first error, name is required. If I press 1 character, now I get the second error, which says name should be minimum 5 characters. We also have category, which is a required field. And here we have a drop-down list with 3 values: development, art, and languages. So let's select category here and change the course title to Angular 4 for beginners. And finally, we have this checkbox, 30-day money-back guarantee. So let's tick this. Now, as you can see here, we have the JSON object behind this form. This object has 3 properties: name, category, and has guarantee. So go ahead, build this form, and next you can see my solution. All right, I'm going to create a new component first. So ng, gc, and let's call this new course form. All right, beautiful. Now we go to app.html and add our new component here. So new course form. Back in the browser. So we get this label here. Beautiful. Now let's build the form. So let's go to new course.html. I'm going to delete all this markup. Start with the form element. We don't need the action attribute. Now we need 3 input fields. First, we need the course title. So we need a div with the class form-group. Inside this div, we need a label. And next to that, we need an input of type text with the class form-control. Now we can give this an ID, like course name, and use the same value for the for attribute of our label. So here's our first form group. I'm going to put the label here, course name, save, back in the browser. So far so good. Let's add the second input field. Here we want a drop-down list. So once again, we need a div with the class form group. Inside this div, we need a label, and next to that, we need a select with the class form-control. Now let's assign an ID to this element and call this category, and use the same value for our label. So for is category. Tab. All right, so here's our second form group. Let's put the label here, category. Now to populate this drop-down list, I'm going to go back in our component. So new course.ts. Here I'm going to define a field called categories. Set it to an array of objects. Each object should have 2 properties, ID and name. Development. Now let's duplicate this. The second category, its ID is 2, and it's art. And finally, the third category. which is languages. Now back in the template, I'm going to add an option here and apply the ng4 directive to repeat this. So let C, as in short for category, of categories, and use property binding here. Bind the value property to c.id and use interpolation to render the name of the category. So c.name. Now back in the browser. So our dropdown list is populated properly. We just need to add an empty option on the top. So back here, I'm going to add another option here. And finally, the third input field. So we need a div with the class checkbox. Inside this, we need a label, and inside this, we need an input of type checkbox. This input should have the class form-control, just like other Bootstrap classes. We can also give it an ID. Let's call this money back guarantee, and use the same value for our label. So 4 attributes should be set to this value. And finally, tab. So this is our third input field. We have a div with the class checkbox. Inside that, we have a label, and inside that, we have an input. Now, let's put the actual label here. 30-day money back guarantee. Let's preview this. So back in the browser. Okay, we have a weird layout because I made a mistake. I shouldn't have applied the form-control class on this checkbox. Save. Back in the browser. Okay, it's working beautifully. Next, let's add the button. So we need a button with 2 classes, btn and btn-primary. And let's call this create. Back in the browser. So we've got the layout working properly. Now let's convert this to an Angular form. So I'm going to start with the course name field. First, I'm going to apply the ng-model directive and then set the name attribute to name. I don't want to set this to course name because in the JSON object behind this form, there I want to have a property called name, not course name. Okay, so let's set this to name. I'm also going to declare a template variable, call it name, and set it to ng-model. And we're going to use this to render validation errors. So this input field should be required, and it should have minimum 3 characters. So minimum length should be set to 3. Now next to that, we're going to add a div with 2 classes, alert and alert-danger. We want to render this only if this field is touched and has validation errors. So ngIf, we're going to use this name template variable. So if name is touched and name is not valid, or you can use the invalid property, whatever you prefer. So inside this div, we want to render different validation errors. So I'm going to add 1 div for the required message. So name field is required. And we want to render this only if name has an error called required. Okay. Now let's duplicate this. For the second error, I'm going to change this to min length and change the error message to name field should be at least how many characters? We want to render it dynamically. So interpolation, we use name.errors.minLength. As you remember, this is a complex object that has a property called required length. So name should be at least X characters. All right, let's test this. Back in the browser. So I put the focus here, tab. I get the first error, beautiful. I type 1 character. And here's the second error, and you can see the number of characters is rendered dynamically. So if you're done with this field, let's move on to the second one. So here's our category dropdown list. Once again, I'm going to apply the ng-model directive and set the name to category. Now, after this, I'm going to add a div for validation errors. This should have 2 classes, alert and alert-danger. And we want to render this only if we have a validation error here. So if category is touched and it's invalid, right? Now we should also apply the required attribute on this select element. And finally set the validation error message here. So in this div, we want to tell the user that category field is required. Let's test this. So back in the browser, category, oops, what happened to our labels? Okay, the reason we had that error is because in ngIf I've used category, but we don't have a template variable by this name. So here is ngModel, here's the name attribute. Now let's define this template variable, category, and we set this to ngModel. Back in the browser. All right, now it's working beautifully. Let's move away from this input field without selecting a value. So category field is required. And when I select an item here, the error is gone. Perfect. Next, I want to add our JSON object for diagnostics. So here back in the template, just before our submit button, I want to add a paragraph. And here I want to use an interpolation to render f.value as JSON. Now we need to declare f. So on the top, I'm going to declare f and set it to ngForm directive that is automatically applied to all form elements. Save. Back in the browser. All right, look, our JSON object has only two properties, name and category. I forgot to apply the ngModel directive on our checkbox. So with this technique, you can ensure that the object behind this form has the right structure. So back in the template, here's our checkbox. I'm going to apply the ngModel directive and set the name attribute to has money back guarantee. This is the name of the property in our JSON object. So back in the browser. All right, now we have three properties here. Beautiful. If I select this checkbox, the value of this property is true. I can select the category like development. The value is 1 and set the name to Angular Crash Course for beginners. Now, one last thing. I want to enable this submit button only if the form is in a valid state. So here's our button. I'm going to use property binding and bind the disabled property to f.invalid. So if the form is invalid, the button is going to be disabled. Let's test this. So initially it's disabled, but if we type something here and select the category, the button is enabled. Now finally, let's handle the submit event. So back in our template, as you learned, the ngForm directive exposes an output property called ngSubmit. So we can use event binding and bind the ngSubmit output property or ngSubmit event to a method in our class. Let's call this submit. And as the argument here, we can pass f.value. Now let's go to our component and add that method here. Submit, that takes a course object. And here we can simply display this in the console course. Let's test this. Back in the browser, once again, I'm going to add Angular here, select the category, enable money back guarantee, create the course. Now look at the console. So here's our course object. It has these properties. Category, has money back guarantee, and name. Now in a real world application, we're going to send this to the server for persistence.